Hi, my name's Bill. I'll be your moderator for the afternoon. We've got a bit of a subject on our hands here, just 3 recent books. God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens. God is Back, Micklethwaite and Woolridge. God According to God, Gerald Schroeder. There's a lot of books being written about these subjects these days. When Religion Becomes Evil by Baptist Professor Charles Kimball. 5 very specific points he's identified, subjects that get into the news a lot these days, as science does, and as this festival is making so wonderfully clear, with sold-out audiences, again, as last year. We hope you enjoyed our little conversation starters, the statements and the handouts that you also saw up on the screen. They're not meant to be complete at all. For example, there were no statements from any Muslim Sufi mystics. They could give us a run for our money, nor from Zen Buddhists, none of their wisdom teaching, nor from Hasidic mystics such as the great Baal Shem Tov. And please note that we asked on the handout whether any of our panelists might actually disagree with any of those statements. Reasonable as they may sound, we will find out shortly whether they do disagree with any of those statements. Randomly chosen statements meant to indicate what this panel is and is not. Our panel is not, we expect or hope, going to be just a matter of 2 sides, atheists and believers, yelling at each other. God exists. No, he doesn't. Does so, does not. No, he doesn't. Does. No, he doesn't. No, he does. If that's what you came to hear, Madison Square Garden's about a mile up that way. And it does get a bit boring after a while, as one of the quotes there from Gary Langer, our ABC pollster, points out. Perhaps one of the really interesting questions may not be, do you believe in God? Which is, in a sense, just a yes or no question. We could just take a tally, sort up sides, go home, and prepare for war. But I don't want to rule out the possibility that we could have some heated disagreements between our panelists, and I certainly won't squelch it if it arises, so long as it is interesting and doesn't draw too much blood. Rather, this is the World Science Festival, and what we will be doing here is searching for the real issues, hoping to sharpen and clarify where the real issues are, the interesting questions these days, in those realms where science, faith, and religion may meet, if they do. To hear from our 3 scientists and 1 philosopher, 2 of them atheists, 2 practicing Catholics, what each of them thinks from their different perspectives are the interesting issues where the latest science, faith, and religion questions arise, and where they may disagree. Let me introduce them, and first let me introduce myself. Full disclosure, I believe a journalist is not someone who sets his biases aside, but is open about them and then constantly puts them to the test, so you have to know a little bit about where I'm coming from, very briefly. I'm the son, grandson, and great-grandson of great American preachers. My father was a professor of ecumenical Christianity when he died in 1975, and very active in interfaith conversations. He and my mother traveled around the world in the 50s and 60s, attending many of the great interfaith and ecumenical meetings around the world in those heady ecumenical days. Our panel is also, in some ways, narrow, as I'll mention in a minute, but much without further ado, let me bring them out. They're all from the academic world, like I also am. I was a kid growing up on the faculty, a kid growing up on the campus of the University of Chicago. And one of our jokes was the problem with being a faculty kid at the University of Chicago was that you were taught to have such an open mind. We grew up in a tradition where we saw no difference between what Genesis says in very general terms and what scientists discover. The joke was that our minds were taught to be so open that everything might fall out, and that could be a problem. Well, we'll see if we can sharpen some real engagement between different issues. So let me bring the panel out and introduce them to you, if the panelists would please come out. Let's give them a round of applause in advance. Starting immediately on my left, this is Professor Kenneth Miller, professor of biology, a cell biologist. He is the co-author with Joseph Levine of college and high school textbooks used by millions of students nationwide. Ken Miller is a scientist and a Catholic who believes that you can be both. He does not believe that science contradicts the hypothesis of God. His popular book, Finding Darwin's God, A Scientist's Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution, addresses the scientific status of evolutionary theory and its relationship to religious views of nature. His latest book, Only a Theory, Evolution and the Battle for America's Soul, addresses the continuing struggle over how evolution is to be understood in American society. So he's pro-science and has actively campaigned for school boards and education candidates, along with Lawrence Krauss at the other end of the panel here, who support teaching of evolution in school. Ken, did I get anything wrong there, or is that basically correct?
It was great, and I liked it, especially the stuff you made up.
Terrific. On his left, Professor Colin McGinn, professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. His research interests include the philosophy of mind, particularly consciousness, intentionality, and imagination, as well as metaphysics, ethics, and philosophical logic. He's published numerous articles and is the author of 20 books. He's an atheist, a British philosopher of mind. He grew up going to church with his family. Personally, he became a non-believer, he says, who believes in nothing outside of us, including God, ghosts, or anything supernatural, after asking the metaphysical questions, what is it all about, and is also interested in the question of ethics. He believes that believing in God is dangerous. Whether he believes that in the same way that someone like Jesus might have believed the same thing, or other religious martyrs, he may tell us, or if he believes believing in God is dangerous for different reasons. Becoming an atheist was liberating, he says, because he no longer had to live with the oppressive feeling that he was being watched. Professionally, he comes to atheism because he says there's no evidence of God and no evidence of miracles. As a philosopher, he believes that the human brain is innately incapable of comprehending itself, and this capacity spawns puzzles of consciousness which preoccupy us. Ideas which he says have been named in general the new Mysterianism. His books include The Mysterious Flame, Conscious Minds in a Material World, in which he argues that humans can still take solace in the inexplicable mystery of consciousness, because by acknowledging our limitations, we're then free to explore other areas of human intelligence that are open to our understanding. Professor McGinn, was that at least not inaccurate in anything I said?
It was very accurate. You didn't mention my main interest, though.
Which is?
Tennis.
Tennis. Mens sana in corpore sano. Healthy mind and a healthy body. I think I got the conjunctions right there. On his left, Brother Guy Consolmagno, a Jesuit priest who has worked at the Vatican Observatory since 1993. The observatory has been around for about 100 years to show the world that the Vatican is interested in science and in teaching science to religious people. There are Christians and straight-up Orthodox scientists there, as he tells us, who come from different continents, all backgrounds of life. They do not limit it to people who agree with them. Quote, we teach it because it is God's creation, he says. He personally believes science and religion, which he sees as answering separate questions, addressing different aspects of human nature, not mutually exclusive. He says Christians believe that the universe was created by God. Studying the universe helps us understand the flavor of God's personality. He believes that science, of course, should be true. And he was educated with a master's degree from MIT, a PhD in planetary science at the University of Arizona, a researcher at Harvard and MIT before he went over to the Vatican. He served in the Peace Corps. Highly regarded among his colleagues in the astronomy field. He was chair of the Division for Planetary Sciences of the American Astronomical Society. His specialty, he observes asteroids, moons, and Kuiper Belt comets with the Vatican's 1.8-meter telescope in Arizona, and curates the Vatican meteorite collection in Castel Gandolfo. He's written a number of popular books, and one of them was entitled Brother Astronomer and God's Mechanics. He's an editor of a popular account of astronomy and the Vatican's book, Let Stars Delight. Brother Guy, did I get most of that at least not wrong?
Two things. First, you mentioned me as a priest. I'm not a priest, I'm a brother.
Forgive me.
And so though I'm a Jesuit, I've taken the same vows as the Jesuits, but I don't lead public prayer. And as I tell my fellow Catholics, I can hear your confession, but I can't forgive you. The other oddity is that the book that's just come out, which by strange coincidence I have with me, has a new title, which is The Heavens Proclaim.
Let the Heavens Proclaim.
But it's astronomy and the Vatican, and it's such a good book you should all buy 2 copies.
I stand wonderfully corrected, and the fact that you can't forgive us may be of some interest to our panelists later. We'll see. And way over there on the left, on your far right, Professor Lawrence Krauss, theoretical physicist and cosmologist, foundation professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University, also an acclaimed science writer. His research is focused on the intersection of cosmology and elementary particle physics, addressing questions about the origin of matter in the universe, Einstein's theory of general relativity, astrophysics, and the properties and description of the dark energy that is thought to account for most of the universe's present energy content. He's a fervent advocate for science literacy. He has written a number of books. The bestseller Physics of Star Trek is one that's most often mentioned, though he has certainly dealt in very specific scientific fields that are a little bit less fictive. He's a frequent editorialist and commentator, and was a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, received numerous awards, including the American Physical Society's Julius Edgar Lilienfeld Prize and the American Institute of Physics Andrew Germont Award for contributions to the artistic and cultural dimensions of physics. His research is so broad that it covers science from the beginning of the universe to its end, which is something I've been wanting to ask him about. But because that would be a story, if you can let us know about that. He's also an atheist and a member of the Reason Project, along with Jerry Coyne, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris. His work focuses on unifying particle physics and cosmology and using the universe as a laboratory to understand fundamental interactions, science, physics, questions, and life of origin. He has, in fact, campaigned, as I said, together with Kenneth Miller here, to have evolution taught in schools. And I think he would say that he believes that science and the supernatural have little relationship with one another. Professor Krauss, was that at least not inaccurate, what I said?
For the most part, it was accurate. I don't sort of label myself as an atheist because I think, like most scientists, we don't think enough about God to even talk about the question. But I will add that that to the extent that I am an atheist, I actually can forgive you. So.
Getting interesting. Well, so our panel, like our handout notes, is very limited, and we're very much aware of that. For example, our panelists are only from within the Judeo-Christian tradition. We have no Shinto, Native American, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Confucianists, Taoists, and so on. And our panel is also very limited, and I think this is a very important point that perhaps in future years we can correct in another way. Not a single one of the panelists, nor the moderator, is anything other than a Homo sapien male from within the Judeo-Christian world. I don't know what you can really hope to learn on this particular subject from a bunch of doofus males. We creatures who can but struggle to imagine whatever perceptions of our existence the basic female form of being may give that us males cannot get, if in fact there is any such difference. We'll have to live with that limitation, if it does exist, this afternoon, until we get to questions from the audience, because I'm sure that there are no doubt a variety of gender identities out there amongst you. Well, the World Science Festival this year has already given us some fascinating new thoughts, even declarations that pertain to the subject of the panel this afternoon. At the opening gala on Wednesday night, we heard Nobel Prize winner James Watson, co-discoverer of the structure of DNA, say in Lincoln Center's Alice Tully Hall, no less, that, quote, "There is no reason to believe in God," unquote. Really? Well, let's be clear here. What happened on Wednesday night there was that a single Homo sapien named James Watson, a widely regarded human among other humans, stated that there is no reason to believe in God. How does he know? He apparently does believe this. Note the word is believe this. Is this statement of Watson's a position of faith? Does he have evidence for it? Evidence. Another word I'd like to introduce this afternoon, bringing that word over from last year's panel, on which one of the more interesting remarks was made by Catholic Monsignor Lorenzo Albacete, a scientist, friend of Pope John Paul, when one of the other panelists last year said something along the lines of, well, there was no evidence when a person started living the life of a practicing Catholic that there was actually anything to it in this belief in God. Monsignor Albacete said, sort of under his breath, oh, well, if you don't find any evidence after taking on such a life, then by all means, I couldn't agree with you more. I thought that was a very interesting logical tack that he took there. Evidence, of course, is essential to science, and according to some philosophers of science, the inherently limited nature of any evidence is related to why science can never deal in absolute proof or absolute truth, according to the Popperian line of thinking about the nature of science. But evidence, always vulnerable, apparently. Have we anything else to work with? Well, we'll see what our panelists have to say about that. And then, last night, at the fascinating discussion, What It Means to Be Human, with Edward O. Wilson and five others, a special focus on altruism as a powerful marker of what human means, we learned of the work of paleoanthropologists and ethologists that the appearance in the course of evolution of a very strong sense unique to our species eventually of what they call we-ness, we-ness, helping us want to have a sense of helping even strangers, may have given us, Homo sapiens, great evolutionary advantage, adding a special flavor to our consciousness, which we may or may not agree with as something that we do or don't have in common with other animals. And the word religion, after all, is said by some etymologists to derive from religio, meaning in Latin to tie us back to a group, perhaps, to a narrower we-ness, which can then, as we know, to our great pain and horror, lead to interreligious wars with too much us and themness, heading straight into atrocity and genocide and all manner of socio-biological and evolutionary survival of the fittest and spilling of blood. Is spirituality something that science can talk about? Natural law, which the Catholics talk about a lot, something that a creator really has in mind, if there is one. What are the interesting new questions given to science? Well, the former head of the world religions at Harvard, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, concluded it's not so much that each of the major religions gives a different answer, but that each of the major religions asks a different question. Well, let's see how our panel can do for us, coming up with their new questions and maybe disagreements. We'll proceed as follows. I'll ask each of our panelists now to make an opening statement of 3 or 4 minutes, and if they could indicate perhaps, just to help get us started, where they may or disagree, if they do, with any of these reasonable sounding statements on the sheet we handed out. And then after we've heard from each of them about what they think are the interesting contact points, if there are any, between science and faith and religion, and by science, let's not limit ourselves to just fMRIs and physics and evolution, but also include, if we can, psychology, sociobiology. I'll then ask each of the scientists to see if they can define for us a starting point of where these 3 realms meet. And then we'll have discussion amongst them. And then the fun part, we'll open it up to questions from the whole room for the last 15 or 20 minutes or so. And let's start with, for 3 or 4 minutes, our cell biologist and practicing Catholic, Kenneth Miller.
Thank you. Well, I always, thank you. I always say I'm going to keep practicing till I get it right, and that's going to take a while. I think for me, one of the easiest places to start is in the classroom, where I spend a lot of my time. I'm a cell biologist, but in the spring I teach what is often the largest class at my university, which is a general biology class catering mostly to first-year students. And I remember one particular day, and I had finished my lecture. It was early in the course. The lecture hall where I speak, it's a little bigger than this one, actually, so I have a large crowd of students. It was about 10 of noon. I answered student questions. I realized it was Ash Wednesday, and I walked across the campus green, went into the campus chapel, and went to Ash Wednesday services, which were scheduled right at noon. It's very convenient. There was a student from my class in there, or many students from my class, one in particular who looked across the chapel at me in what I can only describe as horror. And at the end of the service, I walked out, and she said, "What were you doing here?" And I said, "Well, pretty much the same thing as you." And she said, "But you can't." And I said, "Well, you know, the dean, when he hired me, told me I was free to come and go around campus after classes, and I thought this would be okay." And she said, "You don't understand. You've just finished a week and a half of lecturing about evolution, and you can't possibly come here if that's what you believe. I'll give you a book in class tomorrow." And she did. And the book had on its cover the head of a serpent and an apple. And the apple was in the mouth of the serpent, and the apple was labeled evolution. And this book depicted evolution as the great lie in the mouth of the serpent, an image that anyone in the Judeo-Christian tradition would understand right away. And she said, "Well, you must, therefore, come to Mass, must believe in God, because there's some way that you understand that evolution is wrong. So please tell me what it is. And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, no, I wouldn't say that I believe in God because evolution is wrong. I believe in God because evolution is right. And that confused her immensely. And that's actually the reason that a few months later, upon reflection, I sat down and said, I have to write a popular book about this because this is a common question. And my own interest in evolution in the public sphere goes back to the first year that I taught at Brown University, when a group of students challenged me to debate a scientific creationist, something that I have done several times since and once joined Lawrence Krauss in doing with great enthusiasm in the state of Ohio. And one of the things that was apparent to me as a religious person is that the anti-evolution movement, the creationist movement, is not just about attempts by people to put God in the science classroom. It's about attempts to put a particular religious sectarian view of God in the science classroom. And given my own religion, I instinctively realized something that I think many secularists wouldn't have realized, and that is, this isn't just religion, this is a particular form. And the great deal that we all made with each other at the founding of this country, which is involved and written down in the First Amendment, is that we would leave religion out of the official institutions of public life. It's something that has served both secular society and religion very well in the United States, and that's the reason I'm always happy to make common cause with people like Lawrence Krauss on that issue, and I've been outspoken in it ever since.
And an interesting point here, there are people in the Christian religions, in Jewish religions, and in Muslim religions who all believe that evolution is wrong and that the literal description of Genesis is right.
Absolutely true. There is, in fact, and many people don't know this, a very substantial and influential anti-evolution movement within the Muslim world as well.
Very interesting. And there was a Lubavitcher I met just a couple of weeks ago in New York on a particular anniversary who told me that he felt the same.
Indeed.
Now, very interesting, just very quickly before we move along, and thanks for the brevity of your opening remarks to give us a feeling, is there any statement on this particular list that we provided here, without going into it, that you happen to disagree with, or do you agree with all of them?
I marked out about 5 of them, so I still want to be brief.
Okay.
I'll take one that I certainly disagree with.
Okay.
And that is the statement that absolute truth and absolute proof do not belong to science, which deals in hypotheses. I think it's true that science doesn't get us absolute truth in terms of showing that certain things are true. But one of the things that science can do and does quite well is it shows us that certain things are not true. What science is really involved in is disproving things. Mm-hmm. So the notion that it deals only in hypotheses, I think, is invalid. There are a lot of other statements I disagree with. There are a lot of other statements that I agree with as they are written, but think they can be read in a way that could be misconstrued. So as we discuss this, I'll have 2, 3, or 4 cents to throw in on those.
Great, thanks very much. Professor Colin McGinn.
Yes, let me comment on 2 particular statements which I disagree with, which I think say basically the same thing. One is, faith is what science and religion have in common. The other is, atheism is a position of faith, as is religious belief. So very often, if you're an atheist, somebody will come along and say, you're guilty of the same dogmatic belief as a theist. So if you're somebody who's criticizing faith in God as something not based on reason, people will then say, but you're in the same position because you disbelieve in God, and of course it's impossible to prove that God does not exist. And so they think the atheist is just as dogmatic in forming beliefs unjustifiably as the theist is, and so they catch out the atheist in that. This, I think, is a mistaken argument. So consider what I imagine everybody in this room believes, which Santa Claus does not exist, fairies don't exist, there's no man in the moon, no leprechauns, no ghosts. I hope people don't believe that. So various, what philosophers call negative existentials, that is, statements about the non-existence of something. Now, presumably, if I were to say to you now, those of you who don't believe in Santa Claus, aren't you being very dogmatic? Aren't you exactly as irrational as somebody who believes in Santa Claus, even though there's no evidence for Santa Claus? You would say, what? That's a strange thing to say. If they were to say to you, the only rational position is agnosticism. I don't know whether Santa Claus exists. I don't know one way or the other whether Santa Claus exists. One hypothesis is as probable as the other. I'll sit divine on the fence rationally You think that's a very bizarre way to deal with the question of whether Santa Claus exists. Okay. You think Santa Claus doesn't exist, I hope, right? For the most part. You don't think there's a man in the moon, right? You don't think that. So clearly, in some cases, it's perfectly rational to believe that certain things don't exist. Okay. The question is, the real question in this is there any reason to believe in the existence of something? And have you carried out appropriate investigations or tests or logical arguments to see if there's any reason to believe in something? And have you investigated in the same way any reason to believe in the non-existence of something? And if you've done that, for example, if you, considering the question, is there a man on the moon, and you go to the moon and you go all over the moon and you don't find a man there, it's reasonable to believe there's no man on the moon. Now, if somebody said, that's a bit dogmatic, that man might be hiding all the time. He might be a nomad, and he goes to the other hidden side of the moon every night, and so on. You'd say, well, you know, that's logically possible. I'm not saying there's Cartesian certainty there's no man on the moon, but surely it's rational to think there's no man on the moon, just like with Santa Claus. So those of us who are atheists like that. We're not dogmatically supposing that something doesn't exist where it's rational to be agnostic, any more than somebody who, all of you in the room, who don't believe in Santa Claus or the man in the moon, dogmatically believe something which, it's perfectly rational to deny the existence of something. That's not an irrational position. So you needn't be an agnostic.
So we might call this reasonable atheism.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's just to do with, you know, have you made an investigation? Have you looked at every possible source of evidence? Have you looked at any possible arguments against the existence of God? And of course, there are arguments against the existence of God as well. The problem of evil being the most famous one. So if you've done all of that, it's quite rational to conclude there isn't one. You've got to look at what the arguments are. There's no general, what I'm saying right now is, there's no general principle that says it's always irrational to believe that something doesn't exist. It's sometimes quite rational to believe something doesn't exist. Depends what the thing is.
Very interesting bridging of the atheist with the agnostic position. You say, well, yeah, there are these possibilities. We're just trying to be reasonable here.
And it's reasonable to be agnostic about something where there's evidence for it and there's evidence against it. Suppose you're asking the question, is there life in the universe? It's very reasonable to be agnostic about that. There's reasons in favor of it, there are some reasons against it. Nobody could be dogmatic either way. If we're asking, is there life on the moon, that's not the same kind of question. We know the answer to that.
We've heard from our philosopher an opening statement. Thank you very much. And from the astronomer, Brother Guy from the Vatican.
Well, your Santa Claus topic reminded me of when I was about 6 years old. And being the youngest of a reasonably large family, I was pretty on to what the whole Santa Claus bit was all about. And also what the grown-ups expected me to believe. So I was asked straight on, do you believe in Santa Claus at age 6? And knowing full well that, you know, man does not come down the chimney and leave presents, but also knowing what the grown-ups wanted to hear from me because they thought I was cute, little did they know. I looked at them and I said, well, yes, I do believe in St. Nicholas. Realizing that, of course, there was some person who was named St. Nicholas who lived. And at that point, someone who knew me well said, you should become a Jesuit. It does raise the bigger question of the system in which you're talking. When you say, do you believe Santa Claus exists? The funny thing is, we can say the word Santa Claus, and everybody here knows what we're talking about. We know what the concept is. We know what the effect in the society is. We know what the stories are and how it affects our personal histories and our family histories. In that sense, obviously, Santa Claus does exist, in the sense of someone who literally follows the dogma, the canon, the fat young man who comes down the chimney.
Who was invented by Thomas Nast in this town in the 1800s, along with a cartoonist.
Well, so you say. And all I'm trying to point out is there are larger and larger meta themes behind a lot of these questions of belief. In looking at this list, virtually all of them I want to say, yeah, but. There's, I think I know what you're trying to say, and I think I see the truth that's in what you're trying to say, but
give us an
it's
example.
More complicated than that. The idea that religion is a social reflex. Not quite sure what you mean. Yeah, it is obviously a social way of dealing with God. It's a lot more than that. There's a lot more to it than that. Science is a social reflex. but science is not just the sum of what a bunch of scientists decide is going to be true to be put in the book that all the other people who go to our miserable classes have to learn. There's more to science than that, I hope. And of course, reading all of these, what really struck me was that great truths, I mean, all of these are little statements you could fit onto a bumper sticker, but great truths don't fit on a bumper sticker. I read that on a bumper sticker somewhere. And it does mean, in any of these discussions, you can't take rigid positions unless all you're here is for an argument. You have to be accommodating to say, well, I kind of know what he means. On the other hand, I know there's more to it than that, and I hope that anyone's understanding of any of these topics goes beyond what a simple statement might have of them. Michael Buckley, a Jesuit priest, wrote a book on the rise of atheism. And one of the points he makes is that to be an atheist, you have to have a clear idea of the God it is you don't believe in. Because you can't make any statement about something that may turn out to be what somebody might define as God, even though you might not, that you couldn't possibly know anything about. You know, and there are many definitions of God that I don't believe in.
You're getting a nod from a reasonable atheist over here.
Yeah, and I'm reminded that, in fact, about 10 years ago, one of the first times I was on a PBS show, I was on with Timothy Ferris talking about science and religion. And I think the poor moderator was hoping for a good knockdown, drag-out fight, and he got one, Timothy and I ganging up on him and his preconceptions of what a scientist was and what a religious person was.
Fascinating. Brother Guy, thank you very much. Now to hear from the cosmologist and theoretical physicist, Professor Krauss.
Or as I like to be known, the unreasonable atheist. Yeah, Ken's actually a friend of mine. I wish you hadn't said that about Santa Claus, because I know that really... Anyway. But actually, one thing you said was interesting, because the point you make about you have to know what God you don't believe in, and it's often been said, and I think it's really true, that the difference between an atheist and you all is that there's just one more God you don't believe in. I mean, you don't believe in Zeus, and you don't believe, and so, you know, and it's, in fact, that's one of the many problems with religion is that there's so many of them. But I want to come back and then say the reason I'm on this panel is that I'm really frustrated that there's a panel. We're at the World Science Festival, and why we have a panel on science and religion is something I can't fathom. This is a celebration of science and the arts, and Alan Alda said it beautifully the first night about the fact that arts require rigor and science requires creativity, which I thought was a nice flip of the normal way of thinking about it. But science and religion, there's no panel on science and astrology, on science and magic, on science and witchcraft, but there's a panel on science and religion, and it's just, there's no, if it weren't for people like the Templeton Foundation that fund these kind of things, I don't think that we'd be around here. And I just don't think it's, now people can say, well look, there's a real reason for science and religion, because religion is such a deep part of many people's lives, and I think that's absolutely true. And I think it's going to remain a deep part of people's lives. In fact, I tell my good friend and colleague Richard Dawkins, just get over it, because I'm convinced that it's not going to go away. It is an essential part of being human. But big deal. So are these other things, and I mean, so's pornography, and we don't have a panel on science and pornography. And so, although I'd actually rather be on that panel probably, but the thing is, so you can say, okay, well, look, but Ken Miller and Brother Guy are examples of a key fact that, look, scientists can be deep believers. And when Ken and I are appearing, or when I go to a fundamentalist college, I make a big point that you don't have to be an atheist to be a scientist, and I really do believe that. And the clear example is that I believe in empirical evidence, and I know at least 2 scientists on this panel that aren't atheists. But again, you know, and Ken and I fought the forces of evil. I fought them in Ohio and Texas and on Fox News, and I think, but again, big deal. The fact that there are scientists who are religious. I mean, there's scientists who are axe murderers. There's scientists who are Republicans. I mean, there's a lot of, and so, you know, I don't know what it proves, what it really proves is something that should be obvious, is that people can hold contradictory beliefs. It's part of what's being human. Every one of us, as the Queen of Hearts would have said in Lewis Carroll, every one of us has believed 10 impossible things before breakfast just to go to work in the morning. It's just part of what's being human. And so, okay, but big deal. That doesn't mean we should celebrate it any more than we celebrate any other aspect of human irrationality. And religion really is in a sense irrational. And that's okay, but it's also, in some sense, the antithesis of science. It's based on sacred books whose only evidence of being sacred is that they say they're sacred. For the most part, in most of the world's religions, they were written by illiterate goat herders, thousands of years ago, often far removed from the actual events that they claim to be describing. The miracles that didn't happen then aren't happening now. We don't see them now at a time when science could investigate them. Isn't that interesting? And I would suggest that both of my friends here don't believe in most of the miracles in the Bible or in any of the other sacred books, and they can still, so they have to pick and choose what they want to believe in. And I think that's the key part, is that most of religion is believing in belief. That most of religious people don't believe in the doctrines that they claim to at the basis of their religion. And so bottom line is that science, I think, tells us that the world is the way it is whether we like it or not. And that's a vitally important, if just people could realize that, I think the world would be a better place. And to those who think that religion provides great insights or that somehow science is going to also provide insights about the mind of God, I say get over it. Okay?
I've got a question which is not actually to attack you.
Oh, okay. Well, I was hoping to induce that, but that's all right.
But maybe to attack a very popular book that's out there right now called The Quantum Enigma. And I'm curious, actually, because I read the book and left feeling a little uncomfortable. It didn't feel like the science that I knew.
Oh, most books about quantum mechanics are bad.
Right. And the point of this and the point of a lot of books is that trying to say that at the deep fundamentals of how the universe works, it is, for lack of a better term, irrational.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the notion that quantum mechanics somehow gets rid of determinism is just wrong, and we could talk about that if we want, but probably not here. But let me just finish maybe with the one of the sentences that I disagree with.
All right.
But I agree with you. I think that, well, if you're agreeing with me that science isn't irrational. But there's so many that I disagree with here, but I think one of them is that to be a believer in religion can be very enlightening and enriching, opening the mind and emotions to a larger and more comprehensive understanding and meaning. In fact, I'm already happy I came for one reason. I learned something from you already, that religion is the word to tie back, and I think it's just perfect because it ties people back from actually really accepting the world the way it is.
Depending on what's the tie back. Let me just ask you one specific point here. The philosophy of science, as I referred to before in my introduction of Karl Popper, says that all that any scientific advance really ever does is expand what appears to be irrefutable, for example, Einstein improved on Newton, Newton had improved on Ptolemy, each of whom thought they had a pretty good view of what was out there until a bigger view came in that proved irrefutable, which seems to suggest that our scientific hypotheses, the way they use the language, are themselves not final, but things that the scientific community agrees to believe in, to use that word, for a while, and so that there's in this way not a big difference from what people who have what they call religious experiences say that they believe in, because it changes them internally.
No, I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about science. In fact, is that we all know that every one of our theories is wrong. And you mean
that's not true? You don't know,
especially string theory. But forgive me, Brian. But no, I mean we know that our theories are approximations. That's one of the great leaps forward in understanding what science is. What Ken said is exactly right. All science can do is prove things wrong. It can never prove things right. And so every theory we have, it's not as if the biggest misunderstanding of science is that everything we think today is right is one day going to be wrong. That's not the truth. Einstein didn't do away with Newton in any way, more did Maxwell. He just showed that there's certain realms where Newton has to be improved on. We know many of us are working because we figure that there's things that Einstein's theory of general relativity applies to that we don't yet understand. But when we throw up baseballs, a million years from now, they're going to fall down. They're not going to go up, no matter what we learn about quantum physics. So Science is based on knowing that we don't know, not being certain, being full of uncertainty and realizing that we don't have a complete view of the truth, and moreover, that there's no book that is unimpeachable. In fact, scientists wake up every morning wanting to prove their colleagues wrong, because that's how you get famous.
And just to exactly, and just to be precise and to dot the last T there on the last point you made about the statement here that you took out, you believe that people who use a religious method to try to also look for enlightenment in some kind of practice, a very important word, scientists practice science, and religious people who can also be scientists practice a religious practice. You think that's necessarily irrational?
Well, I think it's irrational and limiting. Yeah, the real world is so much more amazing than anything that any science fiction writer or Bible writer can come up with. I mean,
science fiction or Bible writer? Even though there are religious people who say reality and science, and I know one cardinal who says this, he says, everything I learned from new science makes me all the more amazed about the creation.
Well, we are, I mean, you know, and one of the problems with the quote from Einstein is it's often misused. Einstein wasn't religious in the sense that this quote means he was in awe of the universe, and so am I. And if you want to call that spiritual, go ahead and call it spiritual.
Spiritual is not the same as religious,
yeah, it's not a religion, and Einstein certainly went. But being in awe of the universe is something that you get from learning about the universe, and not from deciding that you're right in advance.
Not from learning about God.
I have two things I want to say to my friend Lawrence. First thing is, I'm delighted to hear that baseball will still be here a million years from now, which is just an absolute joke.
The Cleveland Indians will not have won the World Series.
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt that at all. The other thing is when Lauren gets the chance to speak again, I'd like to hear how an illiterate, think about that, illiterate goat herder writes a book. That's very, very exciting.
I said stories that were told by an illiterate goat herder.
Oh, told by, okay.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, that's a common criticism of the various books in the Bible. The Bible's not one book, it's a library, it's a collection. It's a common criticism. But the thing I find disingenuous about it is if you take the Christian scriptures in particular, it's a fact that the stories told by the Christian scriptures were injected directly into the most sophisticated and the most literate culture on this planet at the time, which was the Hellenistic culture spreading across the Mediterranean.
Although they were written by people after the fact, often.
Of course,
not
no.
There.
A few
not
decades,
the events.
a few decades after the fact. There's no argument there. So I think it is disingenuous to say that it's only the illiterates that come up with these stories. In fact, again, right into the most literate and sophisticated culture of the day. So that's an important fact. I also want to spare you, because I know you and I are both afflicted with guilt as we were confessing to each other back in the green room. I want to spare you the guilt of being on this panel.
Thank you.
It also struck me, this is the World Science Festival. What are we doing here arguing about God? Well, I think the reason that there is a panel like this, although I do look forward to the pornography panel next year. The reason there is a panel like this is very simple, and that is science is done in a cultural context. And in the cultural context that we find ourselves in this country in particular, but not uniquely to this country, science and religion are often seen to be at loggerheads. So the question is there a way that we can resolve this conflict? Is there a way we can put one down or the other down? Or is there a way in which we can ensure that this common project that we all are involved in and we all are committed to, which is namely the scientific enterprise, can go forward within this context? And that, I think, is something useful to talk about.
Well, you know, you and I are in agreement in general that that's a problem, and I think it's important to point out to people that they don't have to be at loggerheads. But again, I say, well, by having this, it just elevates. I mean, it's not worth talking about for the most part. The reason there isn't a problem is that it's not worth talking about, that science goes on, whatever people believe, the world is the way it is. And it's New York City. It's not, it's not Texas. And where I just was trying to convince someone that the Earth was older than 6,000 years. And so, yeah, you're right, it's an issue. But there's so many other issues that I think it unduly elevates religion by constantly having it's like the people when I debate UFO people. They always want to get on stage because it elevates the UFO people, but to be on stage and debating as scientists. And to me, it elevates religion
Let me
the same way.
be very clear about this sweeping condemnation that you have made of a great many centuries full of very thoughtful and intellectually advanced, if I could judge them, thinkers who say it really is interesting to talk about the way we think about God or religion or the mystery of existence, and you've just wiped them out like this. What does Lawrence Krauss know that they don't know? I'm beginning to wonder. So as a way...
That will continue more and more throughout the next hour.
Right, I gather. So as a way to begin to try to get a handle on this, let's pick up one of the first most obvious lines of thought that we often get to, that you began to hint at, and that Professor McGinn, one of the quotes I mentioned from you, begins to hint at. You're quoted as saying that you believe that belief in God is dangerous. Professor Krauss, you suggested that there's something irrational and potentially dangerous.
I don't care what people believe, it's what they do that really
Yeah, exactly. That it may lead people to do it. So let's go back to our philosopher for a moment. Tell us what you meant by telling one of our researchers that you believe that belief in God is dangerous, and do you believe, as one of your reasons for your particular position of reasonable atheism, a belief that any kind of belief in any religion really has a tendency to produce great evil, and by that, let me guess, we may mean something that produces a lot of suffering, although I don't want to presume that that's what we mean by evil. Why do you believe that this belief is dangerous and that it is potentially tending to evil?
I actually wanted to talk about your discussion of Popper, but let me answer you, because I wanted to point out a couple of things about that. Maybe I could come back to it and I'll answer your question. You're putting it to me right now, if you like. I mean, the thing you're asking me to discuss, of course, is an absolute truism, which is we all know, looking through the centuries and in the contemporary world, that religion produces religious fanaticism, which produces all sorts of horrors in terms of the way the religious fanatic treats those who don't share his or her opinions.
Well, you just said religion produces religious fanaticism, and I'd like to borrow a phrase from the NRA that says, guns don't kill people. People kill people. Does religion produce religious fanaticism, or doesn't fanaticism?
That's a complete mistake of the NRA to say that, too.
Well, okay. Well, rather than play with logic, why do you think religion produces the fanaticism?
Well, as a matter of just historical fact, that's the way it's worked. Now, if you ask me to diagnose what's going on, that's a very complex question, but a part of it is it encourages people to believe things when you don't need any evidence for it. Somebody just comes along and tells you, this is the right way to think about human nature, the universe, and so on, and anybody who doesn't think this way should be exterminated, and you just say to them, now, why is it exactly that you are telling me this? And they say, don't ask me why, it's just a question of faith. You have to agree with this. So you go and exterminate them. Of course, that's very dangerous. And that's happened. I'm not saying, of course I'm not saying, that anybody who believes in God at any particular time is automatically out there to become a murderer. Of course not. I'm just talking about broad trends. And I think that it's to do with the fact that people are encouraged to believe things and indoctrinated to believe things which often direct them to intolerant, vicious actions. For example, the recent murder of that abortion doctor.
Yes, but isn't it true that there are other groups that one can believe in that you wouldn't call religion that can also be dangerous just because they're groups?
Sure.
So isn't it what you're talking about here just belonging to any group in the us and themness potential?
It's an instance of human credulity. Human credulity can take different forms. If you have a very credulous, indoctrinated belief in, Stalin-esque communism, you're going to, so that the middle class are the wicked ones, and you go out and kill those then. That's what people do. If you believe in the Nazi ideology, people do it. I mean, underlying all of this, there's always a danger, which is just simply the danger of human credulity being what it is, and human propensity to violence being what it is. If you tell people from childhood onwards that they're in the right, and they're the good people, and the people who disagree with them are the bad people who need to be stopped, well, then people are going to do bad things. It's a truism. It's a truism.
It certainly is a truism, but again, being an empiricist, I keep wanting to come back to facts. And if we look at the 20th century, which you might regard as the century with the greatest mass killings in human history, you quickly discover that the greatest of these, or certainly among the greatest of these, took place in societies that had officially abolished religion. And I will take as my examples the Stalinist purges, which killed more people than were killed in the Holocaust. I will take the Cambodian genocide as another, and I will also take the Cultural Revolution in China as one. And what we see is not the evil of religion. What we see basically is a very human trend towards fanaticism leading to great evil. And I think we ascribe to what I would regard as a naive utopianism. If we argue that if we just get rid of religion, everything's going to be fine, we're not going to do this to each other. We get rid of religion, we will find another political, economic, or ideological excuse to do this.
And the modern sciences...
That's certainly not my view, of course.
I
wasn't holding the view that disagrees with you at all on that. Not at all.
So you're not disagreeing on this?
Not at all, no.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. You point out that that's what I tried to say. Religion is just one of many irrational things, and so.
No, I
know. You wouldn't have phrased it that way, but more importantly, I think it's absolutely true. That it's a myth to think you get rid of religion, you're going to get rid of hatred or greed But I think, nevertheless, I think the point that Colin made is that it does provide an outlet for those who want to be fanatical. It provides an easy outlet by giving you the illusion that you have absolute truth and that you have divine and you have God on your side. And I hesitate to say this in New York City, but I can't think of another reason that people would fly planes into buildings like that if it wasn't that they felt God was on their side. I can't think anyone would do something so horrendous if they didn't think in some sense that they had a divine reason for doing it. But you're absolutely right. People would do awful things without religion, and people do good things either because of or in spite of religion.
At this point, I'd like to interject a fact and then go to our historian in this particular conflict. I have talked to some Israeli experts in the fanaticism who study what some of the Muslim fanatics are doing, and they say that they do not believe, the ones who are doing the blowing up, that they are going to get 72 versions. They would be insulted to find that you thought they did, that they are doing it for other more political reasons. There's a lot of question about this. I'm just raising that point.
Okay.
And of course, this is an interesting city in which to talk about these matters. Let us not leave out the fact that there were a number of religious movements that were European-based, that came from this end of the country, that moved west, claiming religious superiority as a reason to help wipe out American Indian races that were already there. So we have, and here we're getting back towards where science and religion may come together. We are learning more and more from the evolutionary biologists and from psychologists and from evolutionary psychologists about how our species, and Edward O. Wilson would love this idea, we as a species have these horrendous tendencies. And is it not also a truism, I would now ask, that our second statement on this list, there's also a great history of great good that has been done, selfless good, by religious groups. We worded that carefully.
I think there's been some, but I think it's overstated.
Really?
Yeah, no, I really do. Do
you know who the greatest provider of, if I'm not mistaken, large groups of a certain kind of philanthropy in the United States are? If I'm not mistaken, it's the Catholic Church. All kinds of them. I'm not a Catholic, mind you, but you think there have been some?
No, yeah. I mean, as I say, I think that there have been some, but if you ask me the balance, I'm not going to be fanatical about this. I think you could argue the balance is negative.
Well, on that point, we need somebody who's an expert on that, which isn't exactly your field.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at this point, I'd like to go and move to Brother Guy, who is also you've looked into and studied a lot of the history of this debate that we're having here.
Well,
going back to the centuries of all levels of scientific understanding.
Certainly, I do want to get eventually back to your Popper point, because
me too.
That I think is probably, to me, more interesting. The whole reason of our understanding of science and how religion informs why we do science and what we're choosing.
Yeah, the John Paul statement we had on this list, fides et ratio.
But to pull back, I've been very hesitant to jump into this because the most dogmatic people are the ones shouting against dogmatism. It's a sad thing that when you set up either-ors and enemies, you eventually become your enemy. So that in the name of freedom, you set up camps in Guantanamo, that sort of thing. It's dangerous to be that strong, and I'm, for that reason, not going to attack your strength. Because my point would be, absolutely, religion is dangerous. Anything that is powerful has the power to do great evil. There are many things which motivate human beings which have the power to do great evil, but which we wouldn't want to live without. Money, Well, you could eventually come up with a utopian society that didn't have money, but it would have something that would substitute for it. Sex. You could have a society without sex, but it wouldn't last very long.
Would seem like it lasted a long time.
And you're talking to somebody who's taken a vow about this, you know. And so the fact that something is dangerous, science is dangerous. One of the fascinating things when you look into the history of people who are anti-science, and among the groups that have been interviewed about this include not only the fundamentalist Christians, but also a lot of the people who are Wiccans, who are people who believe in magic, people who believe in modern paganism, although many of them are also very pro-science. It's really hard to generalize about these things. But one of the traits that interviewers have found among them is the idea that science is dangerous, that the technology that comes from science is dangerous. And, you know, they're right. There's another sense that science is a white male way of trying to dominate the universe that comes out of a patriarchal society. And, you know, they're right. All of these things have truth behind them, and all of these things are things that we as scientists, as white males, have to be aware of, and have to be aware to pull ourselves back to stop going that way. And so I think it's a very useful thing to recognize that science can be dangerous and that religion can be dangerous.
Let me ask you a specific question. Anything powerful, you said, is. What are the ways in which religion, we could take, for example, your own, the Roman Catholic religion, are powerful? I take it you're talking about powerful not only in the ability, possibly, to get a bunch of people all moving in one direction that might be a danger.
Oh, that's the last thing we were able to do. Trust me.
Well, then what are some of the ways in which you were saying that religion can be powerful? And
it's powerful in the sense that it can motivate someone to do the sorts of things they wouldn't ordinarily do. And let me give you two examples, one from the world of religion, one from the world of science, where an inspiration, you've got, on the one hand, a woman of moderate education from Albania who decides to go to India and becomes what we know of as Mother Teresa. There's a lot of women in Albania. What motivated that particular woman to do that with her life, to change so many other lives? It was her sense of religion. You have, on the other hand, a barely employed recent PhD in physics who couldn't get a job and wound up working in a patent office in Switzerland, who had dreams about what would it be like to ride in the crest of a wave. And rather than just say, well, you know, I'm never going to make it as a scientist, no, he was able to take the chance to write it down, to submit it to a major journal, to be willing to put his ideas up for ridicule, which is a very scary thing to do. And yet, his inspiration, his love of the truth of what he saw in that science, inspired him to go beyond the easy life that he could have had as a patent officer and to become the person we know as Albert Einstein.
But Guy, I mean, there's one thing that I have to comment on. You're absolutely right. Science can be a force for danger, but the difference is, I mean, it's amazing to me that you say this, because I think people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and science can be. Yeah, I know exactly, and I know you're going to agree with me about this. Science changes, but you know, and science has been white male dominated. But you're from the Catholic Church. I mean, come on. The science now. I mean, we're trying very hard to be more diverse, and when we and that's the great thing about science is when it's wrong, it changes, and that's a huge difference, I think, from an institution such as the one you're a part of.
You're clearly not from the inside of that institution, and
seeing
both how much debate there is inside the institution, how much change there is, and also to mistake the Catholic Church for the people who happen to be in the hierarchy. Which, to my mind, is, that's maybe the visible face, but that's like saying that the four of us represent science.
Well, at this point, to keep this connected, religion and science, possibly beginning to think about the word supernatural, which is another word that religion uses that science may have problems with, although science does keep moving into supernatural realms every time they give us another amazing amazing
don't
view
say
of the cosmology.
That's not true.
Oh, okay, then that's a lie.
No, that's a line that, well, all of
That's
us
a
who
line.
are scientists, all three of us, let's draw it in the sand.
What Lawrence wants to hear is it's natural and it's super.
That's right. I always agree with Ken.
And so, well, this is very interesting. So the three scientists all agree that there is a clean line between supernatural and science.
As long as you
Except
allow
the
for the fact,
philosopher's shaking his head.
Yeah.
if you allow for the fact that they too do meet in the human being, who chooses to be a scientist, who chooses whether or not to be a human, and it is in the scientist.
Over to the philosopher.
Where the two meet.
Yeah.
Over to the philosopher. Help us out with the words
One
here.
more quick point about the discussion that was just taking place. Of course, many things are dangerous, including science, including the motor car. The thing about religion is it tells you who is good and who is evil, and who should be saved and who should not be saved. And it makes those kinds of statements on the basis of not evidence or argument, but just faith. And that's what's dangerous. So it's not. It's when you're saying these are the good people and those are the bad people. That's a much more immediate way in which something is dangerous than the motor car or science is.
Well, we're getting a shaking of the head from
but the supernatural question.
Yes.
I mean, I have a more radical view, which I don't think the concept of the supernatural makes any sense. So the question, what do we think about? Does science deal with the supernatural or with the natural? We'd have to know what we meant by supernatural.
Yeah.
It's true that many scientists in the early days, of quantum theory, Arthur Eddington, I just read his book about this, will say, well, the best interpretation of quantum theory is that the world is spiritual. And then they're moving towards some pantheistic position or something of that kind. That's a kind of view that people have stated, and that you could rephrase that as you, I think, did earlier. Science is now accepting the supernatural. I think that's a completely confused way to think about things. The only things which exist are natural. There's nothing supernatural. It's not clear what it even could mean to be supernatural.
Well, let me ask if you believers believe in miracles.
Okay, now let me answer that,
Yeah,
and I'd be glad to. And Einstein, who both sides fight over in this question, once said,
Argument from authority.
Once said, there are only two ways to live. One is to believe that nothing is a miracle, and the other is to believe that everything is. Mm-hmm. And I think I choose the latter in a number of ways. One of the things that you just said is religion tells you who is good and who is evil. I have personal experience with religious people saying, yes, that person is good and that person is evil and so forth and so on. But religion, as I understand it, doesn't tell you that people are good or evil. It basically tells you that certain actions are good or evil. The capacity to do good or evil is in everyone. In so doing, I think you're taking a rather jaundiced view of religion, which of course helps your case. But let me try to put it this way, and this goes back to your question of the supernatural. I've often challenged on the whole notion that one can be a legitimate scientist and also be a person of faith. The historical record that there are lots and lots of scientists who are people of faith. Notwithstanding, I hear that a lot. And one of the things that I'm often told is, well, how can you be rational and logical and scientific 6 days a week, and then 1 day a week you discard that and you go into the supernatural? As if there are sort of two spheres, which is the natural here and the supernatural over here. I think what a person of faith, particularly what a person of faith who ascribes to science does, is to say the natural world is what we can experience. It's what we can see. It's what we can study. But the person of faith goes further than the assertion, and it's a philosophical assertion, not a scientific one, which you just heard by a philosopher, of course, that the natural world is all there is, and that is a philosophical, not a scientific statement. What the person of faith does is to say, to them, the spiritual world is the explanation for the natural world.
The spiritual world?
The idea of the spirit is the explanation for the natural world. It's the reason science works. It's the reason that logic works. Paul Davies, a cosmologist and a colleague of Professor Krauss's, wrote a column in the New York Times about 2 years ago on faith and science. And one of the things he pointed out is that science itself is based on a kind of faith. And the way he got to that was by pestering his instructors when he was learning physics. Where do the laws of physics come from? And some of instructors would tell them, go away, don't bother me. We're just physicists, and our job is to figure out the laws. We don't ask where they come from. But nonetheless, they exist. The laws of physics are real. So how do we account for their presence? Well, you might say you have this idea of multiple universes, parallel, side by side, in which the laws are different in each of them. And as Davies correctly points out, well, that's a way to slip the question, because then you have to ask is, where does the mechanism come from that generates these multiple universes? So you've only pushed the question back a little bit. And the revelation that Davies had, and I think it was quite significant, is neither science nor faith are complete, because they all basically imagine something outside of natural reality that determines the nature of that natural reality. And in the case of science, it's the notion that there is something behind the universe, the way that it is, that allows us to be logical and investigate it. That's something that all of us on this stage would agree. For a person of faith, certainly for myself, I think that explanation is found in God.
Well, I was seeing the philosopher shaking his head
Well,
again.
how could it be that that which explains the natural is supernatural? Wouldn't that make it natural? I mean, the question is, how are we defining the idea of the supernatural? The way you're defining it, I kind of like it, because it's very naturalistic, because now you're saying the reason to postulate God or spirit or something of that kind is as an explanation of natural facts. But I would question then, well, what's the cash value of saying that the explanation is of a supernatural nature? I don't even know what the concept of the supernatural really means, you see. What does it really mean? Equally, the concept of the natural, what does it really mean? It's defined by contrast with the supernatural. We don't know what that is. There's existence, there's reality, true. If there were something behind the observable world, which explains, say, the Big Bang, I would assume it would be natural, whatever way I can
yes,
understand
and
the
the hypothesis, I'll be very brief, the hypothesis built into what you just said is that nature is self-contained and self-explanatory. And I'm not sure that's the case.
I don't think, though, that, I mean, science doesn't require that necessarily, but it's really, and I've disagreed strongly with the statement of Paul about this, that you can somehow equate the faith of scientists and the faith of religion. The faith of science is based on evidence. If the world didn't behave, if you couldn't make predictions that were correct, then you wouldn't have that faith. The faith of religion is based on the complete lack of evidence. And moreover, you sidestepped the key question about, it's very poetic to say miracle, everything. It's true, it's miraculous that the world works, and that's fine. But do you believe that Jonah lived inside the whale? Do you believe that there was a virgin birth? All those things.
At this point, last year, exactly 1 year ago, in the discussion, is when Monsignor Albacete said quietly under his breath, oh, well, if you don't think you've got any evidence as a person who's taken on a religion, then I would agree with you. And he was making a very interesting point, which is that people who decide to take this leap of faith start to have evidence.
What evidence?
Well, hang on a second.
Okay.
They report that they start to have evidence that they experience within themselves that something is changing them. Now, at this point, we're beginning to move very close to something else that modern science is increasingly getting very interesting on, which is how do we experience evidence? How do we know evidence? What is the brain's capacity to structure consciousness of experience and evidence? Now, we don't have any experts in psychology or neurobiology on the stage this year. Maybe in future years we will. But at this point, the word evidence has once again arisen at about the same point in the discussion. And we have a hand up here from the Vatican.
And this isn't actually, Bill, to be fair, we're all associated with institutions.
Good
it's
point.
Just that he's a big one.
Right, and this argument is not exactly new to the Vatican or any number of other...
Right. I'm always hesitant to be on science and religion panels, which is ironic because that's what I spend half of my life doing. And the reason is that I love talking about my science. I could talk about meteorites, and I'd be happy to be proved wrong about anything about meteorites. When it comes to my religious life, I can only tell you what I experience.
Your evidence.
And I can't allow my experience to try to determine your life. Nor do I, nor have you heard me do that. What I do here is a description of the religion that you guys have rejected that I would reject as well. And if that's what you think religion is, then, to quote the Monsignor, by all means, get rid of it. That's a horrible idea of religion. One of the real problems that we have in education, in both science and religion, is that most kids stop learning religion and stop learning science at about age 12 when hormone poisoning takes over, you know. And an awful lot of people never get back to science, and they think that science is just memorizing all the facts in the science book. And a lot of people never get back to religion and think that religion is nothing but what they heard what they thought they heard when they were 11, from people who probably didn't even understand their religion very well.
Do you think kids should be taught religion? I'm amazed to hear that, because I think it's kind of child abuse, personally. No, I mean, religion. No, not in a negative way.
Should they be taught science?
No, because it's such a, you're a deep thinker, and I've talked to many, I'm sure your father was a deep thinker, a theologian, and you are too, Bill, I'm sure. But these are deep and complex questions. Yet we take 5-year-olds and and say you're a Christian, you're a Catholic.
The 5-year-olds have those deep questions.
But they're not equipped to be able to deal with them. Just like we don't teach them quantum physics.
You are equipped to deal with them, and they're not.
No, I think as an adult, I'm much better equipped to deal with them than I was as a child. And whether we should,
why?
Because they're complex questions that require experience and knowledge to be able to assess.
I'll tell you what, it's a legitimate question, and I'll tell you the answer I've come up with. Because, of course, what happened is I'm of a certain age where I was taught all the Baltimore Catechism, you memorized all these answers, and they decided a few years after I came along that was a terrible way of teaching religion to kids. And the result that kids now don't learn anything, except, you rub an orange against your cheek and you say, Jesus loves me, and that's your religion class. The advantage of the Baltimore Catechism was that when the time came in my 20s or my 30s or my 40s, when I would experience something in my life, I could go back and say, oh, that's what they were talking about. Now I get it. As long as you don't think that you got it when you were 11 years old.
There are indeed, as many theologians have talked about, my father had a wonderful sermon on this, I remember it, stages of religious maturation which move beyond the literal, which move into ways of encountering the mystery of existence in various ways of thinking in different religions, so that kids can very quickly be brought beyond the levels of mere metaphor and Jonah and the whale, which is not literal belief that's required of any religions I particularly know.
Are you the same religion as your father?
In general...
And isn't it kind of weird that most kids are of the same religion as their parents? I mean, if there's some universal
You didn't
truth.
even wait for my answer.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm the moderator. I get to not answer.
Yes.
Again, I want to turn to the philosopher who can help us out after making an observation. One of the more interesting places where science and this whole field of religion has an awful lot new, I believe, to offer us is in what's called the new affect regulation paradigm of psychology, which is beginning to find ways of talking about how we actually do relate to each other, because we are, in existential terms, each trapped within our subjective experience. And as one of the comments on this sheet talked about, in a sense, you could say each of the religions might be seen as an existential project trying to offer meaning in a chaotic and meaningless world. Even if you don't believe in it, it tries to give you a structure to hold on to. And so there's that way of approaching it, existential religion, which at first sounds like a contradiction. The psychologists are beginning to get very interesting on the subject with a new science that we may be able to explore in future years. But at this point, we didn't get back to Papa. We may not have time because we have to go to the audience now very quickly. But let's leave the last moment before questions, again to the philosopher.
Well, you raised, I thought, a very interesting question, which I think many people find very important, the idea of inner conviction. They find themselves with an inner conviction that there is a God, and with the properties which religion ascribes to that God. And you ask the question, is this evidence for the existence of God? Now, I want to say something very sobering about this, which may probably enrage both sides. Yes, it is evidence to the existence of God, in the sense that if you observe the world and things seem a certain way to you, that's evidence that something is so. But of course, evidence is not always conclusive. There may be, if I hear a voice one day that says, there is a God and I am He and I control the universe, that's evidence that there's a God. It's evidence. Is it good evidence? That's the question. Because if I now find, as I go out, that my neighbors are hearing similar voices saying to them, you're Napoleon, and then I say, oh, I don't think that, And if I know that this is what people think, then I have to look at well, this is some evidence, what philosophers call prima facie evidence. Now I have to look at any evidence which confirms that inner conviction. If I don't find any, I might just say this is a quirk of my psychology. In other words, you don't, just because it's prima facie evidence doesn't mean you've got to have your beliefs totally shaped by it. You then criticize this prima facie evidence, and you see whether it fits in with the rest of what you know about the world. And in this case, it doesn't. That's why you should reject the evidence in the end.
And you're getting a nod from...
And I'm saying that in other cases, it does.
Well, that's the detailed question we'd have to consider.
Issues, one of the reasons why I belong to a somewhat organized religion is precisely because I don't trust the voice in my head. That I do, for the same reason that I don't try to do science on my own.
Yes, exactly.
You have to do it in the community. You need people to constantly criticize you and correct you, and maybe challenge you.
Well, this is a very interesting point at which to hand it over to the audience. There's been what the modern psychologists might call a lot of very interesting intersubjective affect regulation going on between our four folks here. Now, what we're going to do is hand out, I will get my eyes adjusted here. We have many hands up, and trying to take advantage of an audience which has something other than white males in it. We have someone over here. There is a woman right there with her hand up. I'm going to two women to start with, just to begin to redress the imbalance. Right there, yes.
Hi. Sorry. Thanks for I really enjoyed the discussion. Excuse me? Oh, sorry.
Yes, please stand up when you make so everybody can hear. Well, that's why they invented
So I have a comment to make to the question of why do we need a panel on science, faith, and religion as opposed to a panel on science and pornography, which I'm sure will be very interesting too. There is a climate which calls for this type of debate. It's almost a moral imperative to have this kind of debate because first, as one of the leading countries in R&D, we have one of the most blatantly scientifically illiterate people. And a recent NSF document, some Americans to this day do not know that the Earth is not flat. People have denied global warmings because they are incapable and they weren't trained to understand things in relative terms. Global warming is a concept which requires some form of scientific literacy. The world is not getting hotter. We're not getting closer to the Earth. We're not sweating every single day as the world is getting because of global warming. It's a relative. It's something. It requires an understanding of.
So do you have a question for the panel?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that religious groups have power as far as scientific. Research R&D goes. And as we can tell now, to this day, it's hard to get funding for stem cell research. Why? There are religious groups who have enough power to make it impossible. So this type of debate is very, very important, if only to show that it is possible to reconcile both. Well, there are scientists and people of faith.
Let me respond to your comment. I mean, it's a good one, and I quote those NSF surveys, which show, by the way, that 50% of the American public doesn't know the Earth goes around the sun and takes a year to do it. But, and many other horrific things. And it's one of the reasons why I spend a fair fraction of my time trying to popularize science. But wouldn't a better way to be to talk about the science? I mean, wouldn't you learn more about stem cells or global warming or things if we actually had a session about those things? Because it seems to me the greatest, I don't think having discussions about science or religion is particularly informative, nor do I care to try and diss religion. I think it's unimportant. What I believe, and maybe it's because educators, as an educator, it's like, you know, everyone thinks if you have, the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To me, education is the greatest cure, and the problem isn't religion, it's ignorance. And so I'd rather have sessions where people are informed about the actual facts of the world than debating philosophy.
Right, and my guess is that your repeated statement that religion is ignorance is not going to find a lot of agreement.
No, I didn't say it.
Oh, then
no,
clarify
I said
that
the evidence. No, the enemy is not religion; it's ignorance. There are
the enemy is not religion; it's ignorance.
Ignorance, and so that's what we should be combating. So I don't think the problem is having debates about science and religion. It's about
as a representative of a religious order that has a lot of schools. I'm all in favor of education, but I also know it's not the panacea. I point out in recent political history products of Jesuit education going to the same schools range from Jerry Brown to Bill Clinton to Pat Buchanan. So, you know, if you have a thug and you educate them, he becomes an educated thug. It's more than education. Nonetheless, I think this core point that she makes is very good, that too much in our American culture, religion and science have been put at odds. As a result of them being put at odds, people who don't know much about science but are really comfortable with their religion think that they have to be anti-science to be religious.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. And so it's really important. I mean, my mission is not to convince my fellow scientists to believe in God, because they're not going to listen to me anyway. My mission is to convince my fellow religionists that science is a wonderful thing that not only is not anti-religion, but in fact informs your religion.
And I just want to echo very quickly what Guy said, which is when I speak to predominantly Christian audiences at religious colleges and so forth, and I do that a lot, I always start off by saying the first duty of any Christian is to the truth, and science is a form and a way of approaching the truth, and therefore you have almost a religious duty to support the scientific enterprise.
Right? There's a hand up. If that lady right there, with the 5 fingers spread out like that, right? Yes.
My question really is for the two panelists, the believers. I wanted to make a comment about early exposure to any kind of dogma. My really problem is that some people have an acquisitive mind, where you take them to church, you show them God, and it opens their mind. They'll look at the universe and ask questions. And some people, you give them a science book when they're small, and they'll, you know, continue to study and be interested in that. But really, I think most people will not take the further step. Most people will just take what you give them, and that's what they keep forever, and that's the way they'll think. So I'm just thinking about how would you justify taking really children to churches, synagogues, starting to indoctrinate them when they're young in religion?
Well, I think if you ask a question which is phrased, how do you justify indoctrinating young children? That's a lot like the question of, have you stopped beating your wife? Yes or no?
Have you, Ken?
No, and to be perfectly honest, I brought both of my children up in the church. If I thought that the education that they had received at home or when we went to Mass on Sundays amounted to indoctrination, I wouldn't have had any part in it. What I wanted to show to my children is basically my own religious tradition, the community of believers that Guy talked about, which have a lot of diverse opinions. You shouldn't think that any religious tradition is monolithic. And above all, one of the things that I think one appreciates inside a religious tradition is the significance and the importance of doubt and skepticism. Religion is not all about certainty. I think properly it is about asking very, very tough questions and trying to come to grips with those. One of my daughters has stayed in our faith, and one has left it. In leaving the faith, she's done what I've done twice in my life, as it turns out. And I think this kind of journey of the mind is something that's important, and it's also something that is a part of scientific education as well. I always tell my students that there's only one dogma in science, and that is that science has no dogma. And I think religious education should be conducted. It is not always, but it should be conducted in the same way.
But you're very enlightened, Ken, and I think...
And I like you too.
Yeah, no. No, I mean, and I have a lot of differences with the approach of, again, my friend Richard Dawkins, who I think does as much harm sometimes as good in that regard, by arguing... I mean, my effort is to get people to learn about science, not to say that religion is wrong. But one of the things he does is consciousness raised, and it raised mine in one example. He shows a picture, a beautiful Christmas time picture of these 4 kids, little 3 or 4-year-olds in the newspaper. And the newspaper headline says, here's a young Christian kid, here's a young Muslim child, a young Jewish child, a young Buddhist child. And we go, ah. And then he says, well, if you here's a neoconservative child, here's a deconstructionist child, I mean, the point is we label these kids when they don't even know what the words mean. and it is really kind of an interesting thing that we allow ourselves to label these children with this religious mantle when they don't have the slightest ideas where we wouldn't do it anywhere else. And I think we have to realize that we do, not all of us, but we do as a society indoctrinate children when they're too young to know what the
Yeah,
difference is.
but again, you can indoctrinate both ways. One of my mentors as a scientist was a wonderful scientist named Richard Goss. He's a very distinguished developmental biologist, now passed away. And Richard was a card-carrying atheist. And what I mean by that is if you asked him for his card, it said Richard Goss, American Association of Atheists. So he was card carrying. And he, you might say, indoctrinated his children in secularism and atheism. He suffered the ultimate fate that anybody who's ever raised a child knows, which is rebellion.
Yeah, of course.
And one of his kids is now an evangelical Christian.
Yeah, sure.
This is a true story.
This has brought us very close to a possibly universal fact. Not one of the children that they're talking about, and I dare say not one of you, when you were born, had asked to be born. We all find ourselves in this situation. We have a question up here. You could bring the microphone here. This gentleman here was just standing up at the red. Just pass down the plate there.
Hi. I just wanted to follow along the question about why have this debate, and maybe this is my subjective view of things, but it seems to me the science, the scientific community, has not really been on the attack, and that I would ask all of you, do you feel that it's sort of the religious communities that have been rather defensive and trying to put down science in order to bolster their own position up? That's my subjective view of things.
I think it's fear, and Ken and I spend a lot of time together in dealing with this, and it's people, I think, who are afraid that somehow knowledge will undermine faith. And both Ken and I would agree, and when we work together, that our effort is to convince people that knowledge doesn't have to undermine. I don't believe it has to undermine people's faith, nor do I care if it does. I just want them to have the knowledge.
I think every kind of fundamentalism is based on fear. And you cling to rules when you don't have the confidence to be able to live without the rules. I can't cook worth a darn. I use a cookbook. And when I use a cookbook, at least I get a meal that I can eat, but I know that I'm not a chef. I don't trust myself to not use the cookbook. A lot of people in their lives look for the cookbook in life. As long as they recognize that the cookbook is not the same thing as the truth behind the cooking.
Any other answers here for that? All right, can we bring the microphone around here to this woman in pink?
This question is for the believers. Do you try and find ways to wed your science and your faith? For example, the 7 days in the book of Genesis, thinking that they occurred over an evolutionary scale, thousands and millions and billions of years, things like that.
Well, I'll answer that one specifically quickly as a biologist. No, the scale is wrong. If you took the 6 days of creation and you tried to map them on what we know about natural history, it doesn't work. And in fact, the 6 days of creation in Genesis chapter 1 don't match the 6 days in Genesis chapter 2 either. So I certainly don't do that. And in fact, my own view, and I'm not the person who's brimming over with religious training like Brother Guy. My own view is very close to that of St. Augustine. And St. Augustine at the beginning of the 5th century actually wrote a book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. And Augustine warned people, he wasn't worried about evolution, he warned people against taking Genesis as today what we would call a book of natural science, because he said then people are going to look at the world, non-believers can do this, they're going to discover that what you say scientifically is incorrect, and they'll disregard what Augustine regarded as the real message of Scripture, which is the message of salvation. So no, I certainly don't do that.
I'll go even further and remind you that the oldest writings that we have in human history are poetry, whether it's the Iliad and the Odyssey or the book of Genesis. Poetry is a very powerful way of communicating truths that cannot be communicated in the kind of language that we use for an owner's manual to fix your Volkswagen. The importance of poetry is precisely because it carries you into a place that ordinary words can no longer carry you. I was at Michigan Tech a few years ago, and I said, you know, if you're talking to your loved one, you don't say, every time I see you, my pulse goes up 2.3%. And a kid in the front row goes, well, I do. But most of us don't. It is, I think, this idea of literalism really is only taken hold in our modern industrial and post-industrial society, where we tend to look at books as being literal. I'll end with a little story. A few years ago, I was asked to lead a Bible study group, and I'm thinking, I'm a Catholic. Catholics don't do Bible study. A Bible study group in Texas, Houston, no way. A Bible study group among astronauts. I go, oh, astronauts, I could do that, yeah. And so I was there, we were talking about them, and one of the astronauts came to me and I said, I just want to let you know I belong to this religion that I believe the world is just exactly the way it was described in Genesis, 6 days, the whole bit. And I'm thinking, Genesis says the world is flat, and there's a dome, and there's water above and below the dome. Where does the shuttle go? Why doesn't it get wet? But then I found out his job before he was an astronaut was to be a test pilot. And you don't want test pilots who are in the habit of creatively interpreting their written instructions. So I could at least see where he was coming from.
There's a gentleman back there with glasses on. If we can just pass the microphone.
One has to admire Lawrence and Colin as atheists with no invisible means of support. I would ask if it's not futile to go after religiosity or religion in the broad sense when the easy target is the so-called revealed scriptured faiths, such as the Abrahamic faiths, which can be debunked not merely from science, but from history and what we know about our own human history. And I would ask Ken and brother Guy, is it not the height of arrogance, epistemologically and religiously, to presume this scriptured revealed faith to be greater than, say, a simple deistic faith?
Well, Ken and Brother Guy, and
you guys start first.
Can we start with the philosopher?
You can probably say yes.
I was actually just flipping channels the other day and came across a religious channel, and with straight faces, the people in the program said that the expanding universe, which was discovered early in the 20th century, Edward Hubble and so on, had been anticipated in one of the Old Testament books. And this proved that the book could not have been written by men. It must have been inspired by God, and I thought it very interesting. And they quoted a line from one of the Old Testament books. It went roughly as follows: "And so God spread his curtain across the heavens." And that was meant to prove that the Bible had anticipated the idea of the expanding universe. I thought, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
And you're getting a nod from our religion, but there's more specifically nuanced question about the difference between the revealed faith and the
fascinating thing is, of course, the criticism comes out of a tradition of 2,000 years, 3,000 years of theology attempting to do exactly that kind of exegesis of the scripture. It is not so much the height of arrogance, but the height of humility. To go back to a point that you made very, very strongly and very correctly about the nature of science. Science is attempting to get to the truth with theories that are human-made and thence fallible, but always improving, because we know our theories are never perfect to get to the truth. Science is understanding, seeking truth. To me, religion is truth-seeking understanding. I have these I have these bits of scripture, I have these bits of poetry that there they are, but I don't understand them. I know I don't understand them. I know I'll never completely understand them, just as you never understand a piece of poetry.
But why do you believe they're worth understanding?
Because my experience as I understand more and more has made my life richer.
Has made his life richer. That's your evidence.
Yeah.
And your answer to this gentleman about the height of arrogance?
I think, certainly the word arrogance, Jerry, is a pejorative word. And if one says, I've got something here and it's true and it's beyond question and that's it, that's a very arrogant position to take. And I agree with that. And I think many religionists take exactly that position. But I also think it's important to have, for someone in the Judeo-Christian tradition, to have a realistic understanding of what Scripture is. The Bible, after all, is not a book. The Bible is a library. Every book in there is written by a human being or groups of human beings, translated, retranscribed many times, different contexts, and written for different purposes. And when you read serious Bible criticism, which is written also by people of faith, not for a second would they suggest taking Scripture in what you describe as the arrogant way. but they suggest an approach of humility towards it. Not pretending that it gives you the truth and that's that, but it is something that tells you about the Almighty, or at least the struggles of the authors of that scripture to come to grips with something which surpasses understanding.
So you can be a Christian without believing in the virgin birth or the resurrection or any of the other supposed miracles for which there's no evidence.
Okay, let me answer that, because I know you always like to ask people about miracles, and I think you'll find my answer to some extent unexpected. I think that I have one definition of what makes someone a Christian, and that is that they believe that Jesus was a real historical person and that he was their Lord and Savior. That's, I think, the core of what makes someone a Christian. If you don't believe that, you're not a Christian. People would often challenge me and say, what would it, is there anything that would cause you to cease being a Christian? The answer is yeah, if you could convince me that Jesus had not existed, this was some sort of historical conspiracy made up. I'm sure Dan Brown is working on this. If I was convinced of that effect, logically I'd have to say, I'm dropping this nonsense. I'm not buying it anymore.
And you have, but you believe that fact, and I'm willing to accept you.
Yeah, but let's take,
based on some belief, but not from the Bible.
Well, certainly there is the Testament that is from Scripture. The earliest Christian writings we have, as you know, are 5 or 6 of the letters of Paul, which were written about 2 decades after the death of Jesus. Therefore, in historical terms, pretty close. And they present a narrative that makes sense to me, that resonates with me, that I find as logical, and I also find the tradition to be compelling. Now, let's talk about something. This is the thing I thought you'd find unexpected, which is the virgin birth. And people are always saying, man, you're a biologist. You know that a virgin birth is impossible. And my answer would be, do you know how this happens in other vertebrates? Because there are biological examples of the virgin birth. It happens all the time in birds, happens in reptiles, not in mammals, as far as we know. So they'd say, okay, my answer is, what are you looking for? If, for example, I was to explain to you in biological terms how a virgin birth is possible, you would then say, so it's not a miracle. If it has a material explanation, so why do you accept it as proof of anything? If, on the other hand, I say, I have no biological explanation for it, therefore it must be a miracle, then you would say, well, you'd still insist that I explain it. Even the people 2,000 years ago knew that a virgin birth in a human being was simply impossible. So I don't have any empirical knowledge of whether the virgin birth, to take that example, really happened, and the authors of Scripture were told about it and they just wrote it up because that's the way it happened, or whether the authors of Scripture wanted to call the teachings of this person, whom they regarded as so important, to the attention of generations yet to come, tens or hundreds of years from this point, and therefore they wrote this in as a metaphor to make sure that people paid very important attention to the life and the teachings of this person.
But you find it compelling, but the same story, of
either
course,
one of those would suffice for me, and I cannot distinguish between them as a science.
Just like the virgin birth and the other things would have been applied to Vishnu and all sorts of other gods previously, almost exactly the same story.
And when you talk about other gods, what I see are other people in other cultural traditions trying to come to grips with the experience of the Almighty, which I regard as a common experience, despite the differences between
here's the deal. Here's the deal. It's almost tomorrow. We have time for exactly one more question, and then all of our panelists have kindly offered, because the room is going to be free for a while, to stay, and you can come up here. They may walk down here. You may walk up on the stage, charge the stage after our last question. They will be here to answer your questions. I am very sorry that the whole audience won't have the advantage of hearing the answer to each of the questions from the hands that are up at the moment. But let's give the last question to somebody who may find it hard to get down here at the to ask these further. At the very back there's this gentleman who has been reaching to the ceiling over and over. And so this will be the last question. And after that, as I say, when this is over, you may come up here and talk to our panelists who have very kindly agreed to stay here, join us on the stage, and continue this theological fracas. So what is your last question?
Hello, my name is Eusebio Gomez. My question is, the first proponent of the theory of the Big Bang, if I am right, was French Father Georges Lemaitre.
Belgian.
Yeah, Belgium. Yeah,
Right.
Sorry about that. And he said that in the future, if we wanted to find the smoking gun, the facts to prove his theory, we would need to find. He laid out all the facts that we would need to find. radiation in the background of the universe, and some more. And later on, like 3 or 4 scientists who won the Nobel Prize for finding these proofs, Gomov and, well, I can't remember.
There are many.
Yeah.
Wilson and Penzias in particular.
Yes, and well, in my view, this whole story has brought science and religion together. I mean, it brought them together in, well, the hypothesis of the Big Bang. My question is, do you think the theory of the Big Bang will keep on bringing together science and religion, or will further apart them?
What a great last question.
Right.
And we'll hear an answer from each one of our fellows, and then we'll give them a final.
There's a historical answer. Pope Pius XII, in 1951, gave a talk that essentially echoed what you're saying. The one person who objected most vehemently to that talk was Father Georges Lemaitre, who said, no, you can't tie a religious interpretation onto the Big Bang. He was worried, first of all, that people would think he'd come up with a theory just because it sounded like the creation of Genesis. But in addition, he also knew that all scientific theories ultimately are fallible. All of them will turn out to be more complicated than you thought, as has indeed the cosmology of the Big Bang. What I do think that the benefit of 20th century physics has been is to remove some of the arrogance from the 19th century physicists. We now know how much it is we don't know, and we're more willing to say, let's continue to find out rather than thinking we have all the answers. But beyond anything, whether it's, in a sense, that's essentially attempting to do like the other person suggested of mapping Genesis onto modern physics. And it's bad theology to do that, because modern physics always turns out to be a little bit slipperier than that. It's something that's been called the God of the gaps. You take what you don't know, you say, ah, God's there. And then when you've been able to explain that, you wind up shifting God to someplace else. It's bad theology.
Last comment from Professor Krauss?
Yeah, it's amazing to me you bring up that story, because I wrote about that story in a piece I wrote in the New York Times a bunch of years ago, trying to indicate how, in fact, in the case of evolution, the Catholic Church bought it and there was no conflict. And then it caused some cardinal in the Catholic Church to respond in a bad way. But I think the story has a very good moral, which Guy's been talking about. But let me even emphasize a little more. And one of my problems with this whole panel, in some sense, is that he said to the Pope, stop saying that. Because, you could take the discovery of the Big Bang to provide evidence for you that there was a beginning of the universe and a God. And I should say it's really a profound change, because up to that point, cosmology, the consensus among cosmologists was that the universe had been around forever. And it was in strict disagreement with the biblical story. And now this changed it. So it was a profound change. And he said, you can take it to validate that story, or you can take it to say, look, we have the laws of physics that take us right back to t = 0. You don't need God. How you take it depends upon your religious or metaphysical beliefs. But it doesn't matter what your religious or metaphysical beliefs are, the Big Bang happened. And that's the point. The universe is the way it is, and I don't care what you believe about it, or how you interpret it, or what you need to feel comfortable and safe, and I won't dismiss anyone's need to feel a belief in God if it makes them better. It's the fact that they have to accept that these things happen and interpret the world on the basis of our knowledge about the world and use it to make the world a better place.
But to you, does the universe, the way it exists, mean that, forgive me for coming full circle, that necessarily, when you say the universe is the way it is, that God doesn't exist? Where did the universe come from?
The point is, it doesn't matter. The Big Bang happened, and I want to know how it happened, and I want to know if global warming's happening, and I want to use these bits of knowledge.
So your point is that whether God exists or not doesn't matter.
That's the whole point.
Whether God. Okay. And one very last quick comment from Professor Miller, and then from our philosopher.
One of the people I've become friendly with in the last few years is someone who Brother Guy knows, and this is George Coyne, who is a Jesuit priest. He can forgive you after the confession. And Father Coyne has told me when he lectures about cosmology, people are always asking him, because he's an astronomer, when you're looking through your telescope, out there, the quasars or the pulsars, do you see God? And they're always surprised when he tells them, no, I don't. Because the conception that many people have is that a scientist who looks into space and is religious somewhere finds a little hole in the dike, and that's God's finger sticking in there. In the same way that someone might have said that what Father Lemaitre had found was the beginning of creation. And as Lawrence pointed out, I think maybe Guy pointed out, it was Lemaitre himself who told the Pope, that's the wrong interpretation. I am a person of faith, of course, but I'm also a scientist. And I think one of the things that we know about from science, and boy, do I know this as a biologist, and certainly people in the physical sciences know it too, is we know so little, really, about the world. I think the scientific enterprise is really in its infancy. A very famous scientist once said, the world is not only stranger than we can understand, it is stranger than we can imagine. And I think what science gives you ultimately is a humility before nature. And I think ultimately religious faith is consistent with that humility in terms of the drive that we all have to know and understand and make sense of our own existence. And to me, that's what makes life interesting, makes it worth getting up in the morning, and one of the reasons I was really happy to come to this great festival.
And our last comment from our patient philosopher.
The Big Bang, it's logically compatible with the idea that God created the universe. There's no logical inconsistency between the two ideas. Is it evidence for the existence of a creator? No, not at all evidence for the idea of God. Is it counter-evidence for the existence of God? Mildly, because God, given his omnipotence, could surely have made things a lot more efficient in terms of producing human beings, and so he took a very circuitous route. This actually, I think, is quite a powerful argument against typical creationist philosophy, because given God's omnipotence, he could have just created us all in an instant. Why did he do it over billions of years and so indirectly and so on? So I would say the Big Bang Theory, I don't think God is, is much interested in fireworks. If he was, that might be evidence for God. But it's just, there's no relationship between the two ideas except they're logically compatible, which is to say no relationship.
They've worked hard for us. Let's give them a hand.